Hi, scholars. For this week, we are looking at Chapter 4, AIDS and Acting Up, in our Queer Theory Now book. It starts on page 91 of the textbook, and it goes until, 117. So, like most of the chapters in this book, it always starts with some really good questions. So on page 91, we start with the following. What role did AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, activism in the 1980s and 1990s play in shaping ideas in queer theory? How did some of the fraught politics of the time impact on ideas that would become central to queer perspectives? Why and how did the term queer emerge with AIDS activists in the first place? So these are some great questions to round you in what you should hopefully have answers to by the end of reading the chapter. And I think at the bottom of this page, there's a really important section about how homophobic responses and homophobia in general harmed the response to AIDS. So it says at the very last sentence, the extreme homophobia of early AIDS policy, particularly the lack of government response in the USA, is oft forgotten. As historian Graham Willett argues, HIV and AIDS cannot be understood merely as a health-related issue, but rather have historically been intimately bound up with the political in terms of mainstream political policy responses and social activism. And so as you continue on to page 92 and 93, I highlighted tons of key areas. I starred, I said wow, I said key. And you also have at the top of 92 the key terms box, the difference between when we use HIV versus AIDS and which term the authors are going to be using for this textbook. And I think that one thing when you're talking about AIDS, and it's right in the center of page 92, that AIDS was perniciously seen as a homosexual disease. As early theoretical reflections on AIDS argued, AIDS does not exist apart from the practices that conceptualize it, represent it, and respond to it. And in this sense, AIDS is not specific to the gay community. Its early association with gay men and the ensuing discourse conflating AIDS with male homosexuality constructed it as a disease that was a special issue for the gay community to grapple with. And so I think as you're reading this, you need to understand this misinformation that AIDS is, quote, a gay disease. It's false. It's not true. And that's not the case. But many of the policies and reactions and responses in the 1990s implied as thus and actually harmed communities and harmed those who were sick. And it was with the help of different AIDS activist groups like Queer Nation and Acting Up that the crisis of what was actually occurring finally got addressed. Okay? And so that gets talked about the unfolding crisis section on page 94. AIDS was first identified in the USA in 1981. And then, the medical and discursive origin of AIDS becomes socially constructed in terms of what is going on in the world and who's responsible. And then on page 95, as greater attention to AIDS emerged, talk turned to the possible susceptibility of heterosexuals, with a particular focus on bisexual men and contact with sex workers as possible risk factors. So the expansion of who could be infected by AIDS was expanding, and so it made the disease more visible to some degree. But, theorists argue that AIDS also made gay men very visible, because they were looked at and kind of pointed out as being responsible for the spread, even though it was not true. It's all lies. So there were, I think, a statistic that I found surprising that I noted at the bottom of page 95. In New York City in 1987, AIDS-related illnesses were the leading cause of death among women aged 25 to 29, many of whom were Black and Latino. And where safe-sex campaigns were targeted at women, focus was on women taking responsibility for ensuring that male partners use protection. So then, since numbers were rising in terms of women dying from AIDS, then new forms of preventative care came into place, such as more safe sex discussions. We've talked a little bit in the class about bisexual stigma, about bisexual exclusion from the field of queer studies, and biphobia is talked about, especially in terms of related to AIDS and who might spread HIV between groups. And so bisexual communities were seen as spreaders in this time period. And so there's a little text box on page 97 that talks about AIDS and bisexual stigma that was occurring for those that might be interested. And then, of course, there was AIDS in the new queer cinema movement that occurred. And again, we have another little highlighting box for that on page 98 to 99. And I think one of the really positive things that comes out of this time period is the AIDS activism and the emergence of our term, our use of queer, for queer theory, queer studies. And it's talked about at the beginning of page 9, at the end of page 99 in a new section titled AIDS Activism and the Emergence of Queer. And I did highlight like that whole paragraph. As discussed so far with AIDS came a homophobic offensive against the LGBTIQ community. But in turn, the community responded with reinvigorated activism. It is as if AIDS, the devastating deploratory of the body's energies, had energized the survivors. However, before the use of the term queer in this space, prior to the orientation towards a more coalition-based politics, early emphasis on pride was key. Pride was seen as essential in order to overcome the shame and the stigma of AIDS that was being promoted within medical and policy discourse, particularly to avoid individuals disidentifying with AIDS, which had the potential for fatal consequences. So, whereas there was a lot of shaming going on and there was a lot of blaming going on, and who started this pandemic with AIDS, there was also a lot of pride that came into play to fight against it and to visibility and protection and informational sessions going on. So there was kind of a counter movement with activism. As much as a group might be shaming, the dominant group might be shaming an LGBTIQ group, it caused a reaction to be, okay, we're not going to let you shame us. We're going to be activists. We're going to fight back. We're proud. Okay. We have, as you're going on, there's a little text box on page 100 for the key concept of necropolitics. And so we have Foucault talked about again. And this was a particularly interesting section on the politics of life and death. I found it interesting to read that little highlighted box for more of Foucault's work. And I think the reality is that AIDS as a killer did not discriminate who it killed. And so it ended up eventually becoming a unifying factor because you had different groups dying from it. And then policymakers were realizing we need to do something. This is going beyond a homosexual community. And so then we have ACT UP. That discussion gets started on page 102. They have a key term box as well on 103. And ACT UP described themselves as a nonpartisan group of diverse individuals united in anger and committed to direct action to end the AIDS crisis. Many activists in the group were women, and many were feminists, and they were ready to put behind them the feminist sex wars of the 1980s, and this is our new project. Come in and support and get help and get teaching done. And so they did movements like die-ins and kiss-ins. So with the die-in, activists would lay down in spaces and then have chalk drawn out around them to represent the brutal reality of the crisis and the high numbers of deaths occurring. And then kiss-ins were held during the 9 days of protests. And the kiss-ins were seen as a way to enact sexual resistance against homophobia. One leaflet that featured for a kiss-in said, "Why we kiss," and explained, "We kiss an aggressive demonstration of affection. We kiss to protest the cruel and painful bigotry that affects the lives of lesbians and gay men. We kiss so that all who see us will be forced to confront their own homophobia. We kiss to challenge repressive conventions that prohibit displays of love between persons of the same sex. And we kiss as an affirmation of our feelings, our desires, ourselves." And this statement is talked about on page 103 to 104. So you can read a little bit more about the ACT UP group and the kiss-ins that they do. And again, really, silence equated death. They couldn't be silent anymore about what was going on. That's talked about some more on page 104. And again, the politics of life and death are talked about on page 105. So there's a lot of discussions in this chapter about these two, you could call them a binary, of life and death, and how they were very intimately interwoven in terms of the AIDS pandemic or the AIDS issue that happened in the 1990s. So Queer Nation is another group that emerged in the 1990s that's talked about on page 107. Queer Nation also did examples of AIDS activism. Unlike ACT UP, the politics of Queer Nation centered on outing and bashing back, enhancing militancy, and Queer Nation also held kiss-ins as well, but rage and anger expressed in Queer Nation materials acted to create further distance from the victim status that had been placed in the community with the AIDS crisis. You have the Pink Panthers emerging from Queer Nation, and they act as a type of foot patrol. They're dressed in black t-shirts with a pink triangle with a black paw print with this term bash back on it. And that's all discussed on page 107. So like with any movement, you can have more aggressive groups that, or more militant groups that are going to fight back at the same time as you might have more, I don't want to say passive, but more non-combative groups, right? And so that's talked about on the next couple of pages here. Also having leaflets that talked about the dangers that heteronormativity posed to LGBTIQ peoples, and how it's in conjunction with the rampant nationalism of the U.S. as well. There's a very, very small discussion here on page 111 through 114 on racism, whiteness, and AIDS. And I feel like it's always, a little short, but it's an important section, especially as in the decade between 1981 and 1991, Black men in the USA made up a disproportionate number of the AIDS cases. And yet, this was a cause for little public concern, given the assumption that it was normal for Black men to die young. So, sit with that. That's on page 111. And in general, there was a very disheartening silence about how AIDS affected queer people of color. And color blindness rhetoric was starting to take hold in the time period as well. So it was erasing these deaths in particular. And I think we'll end with a little point out on this gay shame at the end. It starts on page 115. It goes until the very, very end. And basically, this was a way of members in the community to shame their own community from becoming too corporate, in terms of now that AIDS has changed and the way we deal with it and the kinds of medicines we have, it's not the extreme killer it was. And so now we're in this new space, and now you have LGBTIQ communities that are mainstream, that are getting endorsements, that have products made to represent communities, and there is a subset within the LGBTIQ community that says, shame on you for participating in capitalism, and are these groups actually helping our community? Can we consider what it means to go mainstream, right? So I'll go ahead and end it there, page 117. Reach out if you have any questions via Canvas email. Thank you.